Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Battle of the Retro Graphics Cards. And before you even tell me, I know these are not retro graphics cards at all. But there were graphics cards that were worth a pretty penny back in the day, and they were really powerful. These days they can be had for really cheap, but are they still really powerful? Probably not, but I still want to compare them anyways and see how they fare with some more modern titles. So let's dive right into it. Okay, so I kind of lied. I'm really into restoring, servicing, and repairing video cards, and I really wanted to show you guys the state of these video cards when they came to my doorstep. But if you don't give a crap, I totally understand. I will put a little annotation for you to skip straight to the benchmarking and the comparisons. But without further ado, let's take a look at these video cards and what I had to do to get them up and working again. Starting with the GTX 260, it was completely caked in nicotine. Unfortunately, I don't have too many pictures of the inside, mainly just the fan blades. You can see it looks horrible. It's completely caked in nicotine. Like, look at this thing that fell out of it. It's just nasty. The other problem with the GTX 260 was that it has a GTX 280 fan for some reason. I don't know why. Either way, I made it work to the best of my abilities, and it's a little bit janky, but you can tell here there's a GTX 280 fan, and then there's the GTX 280 fan and a GTX 260. It's a mess, but anyways, it came out. I'm pretty happy with it. It came out really clean, and it turned out okay in the end. So next up is the ticking time bomb. That is the GTX 280. This GPU arrived to me all the way from Australia, and whoever had it before, the eBay seller who claims he bought it in a big bulk listing, had no idea how to service a video card because every single component had thermal compound on it. As you can tell, it hardly even touched the components. Even on the main die, it hardly made contact with the copper heatsink. There's a reason why we have thermal pads. It's because it fills in the little gaps and oversights in the engineering of the video card. So I had to go out and buy some brand new thermal pads and then actually cut them up and put them on here. You can see this was all work done by me, and the thermal pads are actually a little bit thicker than the spec of the video card, what it would call for, but it works and it fits. So once again, came out really clean. I'm very happy with it. So in comparing the GTX 260 to the GTX 280, the GTX 260 is basically a crippled GTX 280. They also give it slightly less VRAM, 896 megs versus the GTX 280's 1 gig. The memory bandwidth is a little bit lower than the GTX 280, which I believe the 280 has a 512-bit, and this one is a 448-bit on the 260. Very similar cards though. They're quite similar. So I'm curious to see what the difference in performance is here and just how crippled the GTX 260 is. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to run some more modern titles to see how these GPUs work in 2019. I'm not saying you should go out and buy one, but let's take a look and see. We'll start off with the GTX 260. A quick note before I get into the benchmarks: the build we're using is a i7 3770K with 8 gigs of PC3 1066. That was given to me by my friend. I'm borrowing it for a project which is coming soon. But yeah, so we don't have the most latest, greatest hardware, but this is still hardware that basically lets these graphics cards go to town. So starting off with Black Mesa, the goal is to run all games with a mix of medium and high settings at 1080p. Ideally 60 FPS, but you can see here we're hitting about 30-ish FPS, 30-40 on surface tension. It's a demanding map, and I think that foreshadows the GTX 260's capabilities going forward. Next up was Call of Duty Black Ops 2 Zombies. We had everything set to the maximum, but you shouldn't do that. The depth of field completely cripples this video card. As soon as you aim down the sights on your gun, your frame rate tanks to a low 20s. Overall, it was about a 30 FPS experience with VSync, so we turned that off and we were seeing about 30, 40, just like Black Mesa, even though the figures back there were a little bit higher because I was in a smaller area of the map. But regardless, I actually got so involved in this game of zombies though that I managed to make it to like 17 rounds or something in town, so it was playable, but you really have to turn off the depth of field effects because it will destroy your frame rate. Next up was Yume Nikki Dream Diary. This game decided it wasn't even really going to run at all. On the menu screen you'd get like 20 FPS, and then in game everything turned to black. So if you're curious, I put up a quick few seconds here of the frame rate and such, but literally the game's unplayable. All the textures are black for some reason, I don't know why. Lastly, it's Killing Floor 2. We set most of the settings to high, but the AA I bumped it down to 4x AA, so either way the game was running at about 40 FPS on average. We would see some dips into the 30s when a lot was going on, but it was actually quite playable, so that's pretty cool. So the foreshadowed conclusion we can get at is that the GTX 260 can run games with about medium-high settings at 1080p and pull off about 30 FPS, which is okay, but some people want more than 30 FPS. So can the GTX 280 do it? Is it really that much better? Let's find out. Black Mesa now sees a consistent 60 FPS experience. Well, I shouldn't say entirely consistent. We do get dips into the 50s sometimes, but overall, it's about a 60 FPS experience. Much more playable. Call of Duty Black Ops 2 Zombies sees a boost to 50-ish FPS, sometimes 60. Once again, turn off your depth of field effects because it just tanks the frame rate, but otherwise it was a lot more playable. Yume Nikki Dream Diary, we get black textures again and the frame rate is just the same, so not really much to say about this game. Killing Floor 2, the GTX 280 performed the same as the GTX 260, which I found quite odd. I'm not really sure why that is, but it was still relatively playable. So my theory is the GTX 260 performs about half as good as a GTX 280. Obviously, you don't want to use them in 2019 unless you're planning to build kind of a vintage computer that runs games like Need for Speed Most Wanted, Unreal Tournament 3, Half-Life 2. It'll work totally fine for those games at 1080p, but it's just not something you want to be using for anything else in 2019. Still though, really cool cars, and it was cool to put them head to head. So let me know what you think about these two has-been GPUs from 2008. I think, once again, it was really fun to test these and push them to their absolute limits, but they're better off suited for kind of a Windows Vista gaming computer or Windows XP gaming computer.